Hello, 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 everybody. Today, how are you? How's everything going? Everyone's joining, everyone's getting caught up. Hello, Dammy7777. I'm doing very well. Not great, but very well. I will tell everyone today is going to be a shorter live. Currently in the hospital for my grandmother, so if you guys could pray, send good energy, thoughts, whatever you guys do, just toss them this way. That would be very nice. Family would be very appreciative. Thank you all. That's great. But let's get to the novel. So, as I originally had said, we were going to discuss a bit of the introduction today, as well as talk a little bit about the next book. And I've made a couple of decisions today. I hope we'll talk about that later at the end of the live. But it will be a shorter live than we normally have. So I want to jump right into it if that's cool with everyone. So I'm going to read a bit of the preface from this. I'm going to read a bit from the introduction so that we can all kind of be on the same page. And I want to use the introduction to kind of guide our discussion into the entirety of this novel. So let me dive in. Give me a second. All right, ready? I'm going to read to you guys. Is that okay? It's going to be a bit, and then I'm going to dive back and forth. All right? So, if we take out a map of the novel, we find, if it is a general one, that it falls into three sections. The 18th century novel, the Victorian novel, and the modern novel. And these descriptions point not simply to 3 centuries, but to decisive changes that have taken place within the form of the novel. These changes are often due to historical circumstances, and sometimes they can be described in terms of the ruling ideas of the age, or the literary expectations of the reader. That specifically is how we view this novel. Our literary expectations have changed, and I think that we no longer see William Golding's work as just what it was originally intended, but we see that and more because of all the history that has been able to build up until this point. But there are other changes and shifts in fiction which seem to arise from the very nature of the novel itself. A shift of this kind may be seen in a usual classification into fables and fictions. It's a little difficult to define this difference satisfactorily in the abstract, but it is fairly easy to see what is meant in practice. So, when, for instance, D.H. Lorne wrote one of his letters, "I am doing a novel which I have never grasped. Damn its eyes, here I am at page 145, and I have no notion what it's about. It's like a novel in a foreign language, which I don't know very well." He was almost certainly occupied in writing a fiction, not a fable. In other words, a fiction is something which takes the form of an exploration for the novelist, even if it lacks the very extreme position from which Lawrence describes. With a fable, on the other hand, the case is very different. Here the writer begins with a general idea. The world is not the reasonable place we are led to believe. All power corrupts, and seeks to translate into fictional terms. In this kind of writing, the interest of the particular detail lies in the way it points to the generalization behind it. It is generally very easy to say what a fable is about, because the writer's whole purpose is to make the reader respond to it precisely in that way. So, here the writer of the introduction, I'm pretty sure it's William Golding himself. Let me double check that. Yeah, he's telling you the differences of the two forms of novels that we can come across. And we've come across multiple ourselves. We've come across a couple of fictions, and we've come across a couple of fables. Now, what he's saying is that he's positing that this book plays both of those roles. It is acting as a fable at the same time as acting as a fiction. And then he goes down into that. He goes, now when we turn to Mr. Golding's Lord of the Flies, we find that what is remarkable is that a fable and fiction happen simultaneously. So, we're talking about these two different things. And I think we should all take a deeper look into the books that we've read and the books that we're going to read in the future and see what category each of these books fall under and what the writer's intentions may or may not be. So I'm going to read a little longer, if that's okay. Is that cool? Okay, so I'm gonna continue to read about another page and a half. I hope that's okay. So, when we first begin to write and talk about Mr. Golding's novel, it is the aspect of fable which occupies our attention. And this is very natural because the book is a very satisfying one to talk about. I think we know that. Mr. Golding, on our account might run, is examining what human nature is really like, if we could consider it apart from the mass of social detail which gives a recognizable feature to our daily lives. Mr. Golding's assumption is one that most of us make one time or another. Of course, we say of someone, he's not really like that. And then we go on to construct an account which assumes that a distorting film of circumstance has come between us and the man's real self. What he's done in Lord of the Flies is to create a situation which will reveal in an extremely direct way. Oh, I just lost my spot. In an extremely direct way, the real self, and yet at the same time to keep our sense of credibility, our sense of the day-to-day world lively and sharp. He's not trying to destroy the world that we are a part of. He's trying to make us examine it from a different point of view. Kenzie Courtney, I love how you say it reminds me of the intro to Fahrenheit and how they discuss that many novels are a warning of what could happen if we continue on a certain path. I think Golding is doing a very similar thing. Awesome. So I'm going to keep reading. It is rather like performing a delicate heart operation, but feeling that the sense of human gravity comes not through the actual operation, but through the external scene, the green-robed figures, the arc light which casts no shadow, the sound of the car in the streets outside. And it was in Ballantyne's Coral Island, which, if we remember on the last page of the book, when the naval officer is speaking to Ralph, he goes, like Coral Island. And Ralph kind of gives him one of those. So Coral Island, a book published in the middle of the last century, that Mr. Golding found the suggestion of the external scene. So Mr. Golding's adventure story is to point up in a forceful and economic way the terrifying gap between appearance and the reality. So we have the appearance of this beautiful island, but the reality of what these boys are going through. So I'm going to skip forward. Turning from these general considerations of Mr. Golding's fable to the way it is actually worked out, we find the novel divided into 3 sections. The first deals with the arrival of the boys on the island, the assembly, the early decisions about what to do. The emphasis falls on the paradisal landscape, the hope of rescue, the pleasures of day-to-day events. The second part of the book could be said to begin with that threat, when the threat takes on a physical reality with the arrival of the dead airmen. Because then that's the first time that we're starting the beast, that's when the beast becomes real for them. Destruction is everywhere. By now, the nature of the destroyer is becoming clearer. It is not the beast or a snake, but the man's own nature. And Simon's death authenticates this truth. And now, the fact of evil has actually been created on the island. The airman is no longer necessary, and then you see his body flies into the ocean. And then the third part of the book, and the most terrible, explores the meaning and consequences of the creation of evil. Complete moral anarchy is unleashed in Simon's murder. The world of the game, which embodied in however an elementary way, rule and order, is systemically destroyed because hardly anyone can now remember when things were otherwise. So, when we look at the novel, now that we've read it, and we can look at it from those three into those three parts, to me it really helped me put all of my thoughts about this novel down on paper and have like a really cool idea about it, and really appreciate the mastery that Mr. Golding did with this novel. I'm going to read you a line from the rest of it because I really love it. The importance of this book. It is the gifts which are peculiar to a novelist to make you hear. Wait, no, is that where I want to write that? No, I wanted to read the other one. Okay, so whether Mr. Golding has written a good novel or not is not because of the views which may be deduced from it. And we'll talk about that when we start talking about what I saw, about what you saw. But because of his claim to be a novelist. It's a novel because he says it is. Art is art because you say it is. No one can tell you it's not. And the function of the novelist, Joseph Conrad once said, is, by the power of the written word, to make you hear, to make you feel. It is, before all, to make you see. And that's what William Golding has done with Lord of the Flies. Everyone that's asking me about the name of the book, Lord of the Flies. So, I'll talk about what I thought, and then I'll talk about how that kind of guided into what this introduction ended up teaching me. I'm so happy I didn't read it until we finished the book, because of all of these ideas that I already had. So naturally, if we look at some of the literary devices used in this book, when I specifically am talking about color, when I'm talking about repetition, and when I'm talking about personification. There's a lot of really interesting things, most especially in the last chapter. We go from the world where everything's clear and beautiful and brilliant and bright, and the conch is this bright white shell, to the end where the sky is black, and the green and black of the boys covered in dirt with their faces in red. It's such a flip. And then, for that to be confronted with reality, when the Navy captain comes back and sees all these boys in black and green, and he's wearing his pristine white, sense of order. It's interesting. Then we also have to look at the fact that the conch was always this brilliant white. And it was the call to order. It was their thing for assembly and for rule and for society. Or the good parts of society, the parts that make everyone work together. And then when they fall into this hole, it takes... And the fire everywhere at the end. Yes, Camille. And then it takes this new call to order with an adult. And the first thing he says, where are the adults? For me, I'll say that I thought there were some extremely religious undertones in this book. Simon, knowing the truth at the top of the mountain, comes down to try to convey this truth to his fellow humans. Very much like, now as I was raised Catholic, so my religious undertones when I finished it like a week ago, I was like, oh my gosh. Simon, the giver of knowledge, right? He's coming down to be like, guys, there is no beast. The beast is us. To me, I'm like, God, Jesus. And then he comes down, and what is he? He's killed by his own people. Because he has the gift of knowledge. And they do it in a ritualistic way. Crazy. In a ritualistic way. Now, when we continue, Camille, with your point of the naval officer, what if the naval officer is more like a god? This was my whole line of thinking, guys. This isn't what it is. This is my line of thinking. Then I was like, oh, then the naval officer, dressed in white, brings back order to the island and says, what? You're British boys. You should have done better. I see that very much like God, not understanding the problems with humanity. Like when God had Moses bring down the things to the people, and he's like, they didn't get it. So I guess I have to send my son to figure it out, because I couldn't figure it out. I tried to tell this guy to tell people, so maybe I have to be there myself. And that's a very Catholic belief in teaching. So it was very interesting. But in the introduction to the book, it's literally talked about how this book is so brilliant because the perception that you come from lends itself to another thought. And I'm going to read that really quickly, and then I'll start reading everyone else's comments and getting into it. If we are to look at Lord of the Flies from the point of view of being a fable, this is the kind of account we might give. And as far as it goes, it is a true account. The main weakness in discussing Lord of the Flies is that we are too often inclined to have our description. So we find a Christian being deeply moved by the book, in arguing that its greatness is tied up in the way in which the author brings home to a modern reader the doctrine of original sin. Or we find a humanist finding the novel repellent precisely because it endorses what he feels to be a dangerous myth. Or again, on a different level, we find a liberal asserting the importance of this book because of its unwavering exposure of the corruptions of power. Now, whatever degree of truth we find in these views, it is important to be clear that the quality or otherwise of Lord of the Flies is not dependent on any of them. Whether Mr. Golding has written a good novel or not is not because of the views which may be deduced from it, but because of his claim to be a novelist. And the function of a novelist is, by the power of the written word, to make you hear, to make you feel. It is, before all, to make you see. So I was like, wow, they nailed it. That's so cool. So now, sorry, I had to do that little introduction because I was so excited to just kind of share that little bit with you guys. Thanks for listening. Now we'll go into the discussion. I'm going to skip forward to the bottom of the comments. So if you had a comment that you wanted me to read, please repost it. If you feel like your ideas have changed, rewrite one. Just bring them back because I scrolled all the way down because now we're going to have that discussion. So, talk about the quote about Ralph in chapter 12. Can you give me the first few words? Chapter 12 is the last chapter, so if you can just give me the first few words, if you can write it, that'd be great. We can talk about a lot. So let's talk about where we left off and how the boys... Where did we leave off? We ended with chapter 9, right? And that's where we were supposed to go? Okay, my favorite quote of all time is, maybe there is a beast, maybe it's only us, because I was very surprised that a human is able to say something like that. Anna Cat Fernandez, you made it! I was worried you weren't going to make it. Thank you for coming. Okay. Well, if you're going to get in trouble, go back to work, but thanks for stopping by. Very powerful. Thank you. The fact that the shell and Piggy were both amazing parts of power and they went out. I see them as parts of power, but also parts of reason. The bits of society that held people working together. Think the conch was the image, the visual representation of assembly. It created a unity amongst all the boys, and when Ralph blew the conch, they all assembled. It was a community, and Piggy was very much for that, and always pushing forward this idea that we needed to work together, because he was weaker than the boys, and he didn't have as great a vision, so I think Piggy understood the dependency upon other people that humans naturally have, in a way that someone like Jack, who felt like he was the hunter, and that he was giving things, doesn't, and maybe was not aware of. So that's a really cool insight, Nicole. Ralph wept for the end of innocence. The darkness of man's heart, or something, the blackness of man's heart. Remember, this book was written by William Golding in 1954, which is about 9 years after World War II ended, a time when the worst possible things man can do to man happened. Not to mention the mushroom cloud that killed thousands upon thousands of people in one stroke. We developed a destructive power that John F. Kennedy said World War III might be fought with nuclear bombs. Oh, I don't know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but I assure you World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. So he's writing this at a time reflecting on the destructive power of humanity, and how that is a very real part of us. And then Simon making that discovery with the skull of the pig, which I think was so interesting. Again, the white skull, but surrounded by the black and green flies. There's that color there. There's that literary device to help us understand what's going on. That's the balance there. I thought that was really cool. What struck me most was the realization that they are all small children, at least in the naval officer's eyes. They are suddenly little boys and not big uns or little ones. Yes, interesting, right? I found another similarity between 1984 and this book, the topic of sacrifice. Ralph would sacrifice the kids just like Winston would sacrifice Julia to save himself. Where did he want to sacrifice the kids? Can you give me a chapter reference? Because that's interesting. As an English major, this is what my life is all about. In class, we always talk about the intention of the authors and how much it does or doesn't matter when reading it. I think one of the things we very much see, and we saw it in while we were reading Catch-22, and we were seeing it when we first started discussing this book, was that the lens of our current society in 2018 does not allow us to see past whether the racial inequalities or the gender inequalities present in the world in which the books we've read were written. Now we're very aware of inequality, and we are very upset when it's present. And that was something that was not present when this book was first written in 1954. Not present, but not generally considered part of society. Now there is a movement moving, not that it hasn't happened before, but society as a whole is more aware of this. I was saying that this book is so good because it definitely helps us to understand our bad and good parts, even when we are truly afraid of who we are. Can we talk about them killing the pig? Tanya reads, we can definitely talk about them killing the pig. Give me a paragraph or something, write something that you want me to start with, and then if you keep having comments, let's talk about it. When the naval officer saves the kids and Ralph realizes he's going to come back, I was devastated when I read that Piggy was dead. Me too. But there's something it's something in Piggy that Ralph was always able to accept and understand with Jack. But Piggy wasn't. And that was Jack and the rest of the tribe's propensity to accept what felt instinctively good immediately. Ralph saw both sides, but he was able to see through the reason, where Piggy could only see the reason. I think Piggy and Ralph were the binary. Piggy and Jack were the binaries, the opposites. And Ralph was the one that sat in the middle. I haven't seen the movie yet. I'm probably going to watch it soon, but I haven't seen it. I see the shell in Piggy as the end of civilization. If the shell went to a million pieces while Piggy was holding it, and a moment later Piggy died. Yes, Piggy deserved better. Yes. I was saying that this book is so good because it definitely helps us understand the war was an important narrative in the novel. Absolutely. Technically the novel is set either on the day or right after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they were on a flight and they crash landed. So it was just after that. But how are we able to learn to work together and not end up like they did? As in, they all had the common goal at the end of wanting to survive, yet they couldn't do it properly. This is an interesting question. And I'm going to read something from the introduction, yet again, that I think lends itself to a tool we can have. Ultimately, Mr. Golding's book is valuable to us, not because it tells us about the darkness of man's heart, but because it shows it. Because it is a work of art which enables us to enter into the world it creates and live at the level of a deeply perceptive and intelligent man. His vision becomes ours, and such a translation should make us realize the truth of Shelley's remark. Shelley is Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Her remark that the great instrument for moral good is the imagination. So in what you're asking, how do we learn to work together? By reading, by creating art, and then by doing it, by experiencing it, by trying to understand and by all perpetuating it in our individual actions and decisions, I think. I think this point of the book is that evil is present even in the youngest of us. I think that the point of this book is that, but I wouldn't say it's in the youngest of us. I think evil is present in us. Being good is a decision. or choosing to follow that morality is a decision. But how much of our decisions come from the society that we were raised in? And what is humanity's... I think this book is really questioning what is humanity's true nature. And I think based on the world that William Golding was coming from in 1954, he was really... I think there was a serious grappling with... there's that question that Faust presents to us. Goethe's Faust. Are humans inherently good or inherently evil? How's it going? I think that's present with that. All right, guys, I have to go now. I am sorry that we are going to cut this live short. But I think I told you guys where I am. We're making some decisions, so I'm sorry that I have to run now. But we will talk again later. We're going to have a live at the end of this week sometime to talk about the introduction of Handmaid's Tale. I've also made a decision. I'm going to be very busy this summer. I'm going to be traveling a lot, and I have a lot to do. So I've decided to postpone Rosende reads for the summer. So I'm thinking we'll have a discussion later this on Friday. Just know that this is the way I was thinking. I have to go now. I'm sorry, guys, but please, again, good thoughts, energy, prayers for my grandmother. That'd be great. And I will see you guys next time. I'm sorry this was a short one, but I hope I was able to say how I feel, and this novel was incredible. Thank you for reading with me. But I'll post again. We'll have a discussion on Friday and kind of further discuss the things I just brought up at the end here. Have a good day, guys. Remember, keep reading, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep being positive forces of change in the world. Tell your grandparents you love them.